Unitarian Universalism has a somewhat unique place in America's religious tapestry. We are, of course, a liberal religion, but that's not what makes us unique. Every major religious tradition has liberal branches. In fact, for starters, it might be worth taking a look at what makes a liberal religious tradition different from a conservative one. Very briefly, the more conservative a religion is, the more it concentrates on human worthlessness, the church's authority, and the afterlife. You are not worthy of salvation on your own. At best, you can only avoid eternal punishment if you believe and behave in certain prescribed ways, period. Liberal religion emphasizes human worthiness and ethical relationship in the here and now. So, worthlessness, authority in the afterlife versus worthiness and relationship in this life. Of course, different traditions line up all sorts of ways between those extremes. The person can write a whole book on it. Some people have. Unitarian Universalists are very much about ethical relationship in the here and now, but we're not the only ones. If you look at the Reformed Jewish tradition, Christian Congregationalists, or Disciples of Christ, just for starters, they begin with creedal statements about the nature of God and the soul, but they pretty quickly go to how our religious outlook needs to make our ethics manifest in daily life, what discipleship means in real world practice. What does make Unitarian Universalism different is that we don't start out with a creedal statement at all. We don't have a creed. What we do have is our 7 principles, which we agree to affirm and promote. And our 7 principles have been evolving for 60 years. But for now, let us merely note that they don't say a word about God or belief or the afterlife or people's souls. Unitarian Universalists have religious beliefs that are all over the map. One person's an atheist, another is a non-theistic Christian, another is a theistic non-Christian or pagan or mystic. There's just no end to it. Suffice to say, our 7 principles are not about what we believe. They're our best stab for the time being about how we want to live with one another and with the world around us. And I often say, a creedal statement, be it the Nicene Creed or one of the faith statements I referred to earlier, represents the end of a long conversation. For us, our 7 principles should be the beginning of a conversation about what that principle means to us in our daily practice. Our 7 principles are an ongoing conversation and a living promise. They have changed in the past. They will almost certainly change in the future. Just for the record, when the Unitarian Universalist Association first formed in the 1960s, there were only 6 principles, and they would be unrecognizable to anyone who joined in the 21st century. Which brings us to the key word in the principles as they're now constituted, because there's a word for that living promise I mentioned, and that word is covenant. The 7 principle statement in our association bylaws begins by saying, we, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote, and then it launches into the 7 principles themselves. And it's worth noting that in the principle statement, that word covenant is a verb. We covenant to affirm and promote. Once you've done it, of course, it's a noun. You've used democratic process to construct a living promise between equals, and that's important. That word covenant has multiple definitions and a very ancient history going back 3,500 years to relationships between kingdoms and empires in the ancient Near East. We can break down their treaties, covenants, into two kinds. As this morning's reading specifies, we have what scholars call parody treaties and vassal treaties. Hundreds of years later, when Hebrew scribes were comprising what became variously known as the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, or what some Christian traditions now call the Old Covenant, they modeled their allegiance to their Lord, Yahweh, using the language of the diplomatic treaties of their day. They were worshipers, and Yahweh was God, so a promise between equals would not have been appropriate, so they framed their covenant as a vassal treaty with Yahweh as the overlord. Crucially, though, ancient Hebrews did add an ethical element to their covenant with God. And the Encyclopedia of Religion tells us that, quote, the religious covenant called for two different things: allegiance to a single God and observance of important mutual obligations in the society, a respect for life, property, justice, and so on, close quote. But the article goes on to emphasize that that second part was not just something you believed, it was something you did. In other words, ancient Hebrew covenants prescribed both the way they would worship and the way they would act toward one another in the real world. And the best known covenant, not the first, but the best known, is what we now call the Decalogue, aka the Ten Commandments. For the record, the Ten Commandments consist of 4 ritual rules, how they would worship, and 6 ethical rules. In effect, they were a living promise to worship faithfully and in certain ways, but also to act justly and ethically, including toward those who were weakest. Also, for what it's worth, if you read the Gospels carefully, Jesus of Nazareth threw out the 4 ritual commandments. When he refers to the commandments, he uses only the 6 ethical commandments. Jesus was basically a religious liberal, and one gripe I have with fundamentalist Christianity today is that it worries so much about ritual and hierarchical rules and cares so little about the ethical relationship that Jesus actually preached. That's just my opinion. But here's why that happened. When Christianity became the religious arm of the Roman government 300 years after Jesus died, the emperor didn't care about Jesus' ethical teaching. The church stayed in power by pleasing the emperor. So, from St. Augustine on, ethical conduct and right relationship became subservient to authority, belief in the godhood of Jesus as defined by church authorities, rather than the teachings of Jesus. Even after Rome fell, you could not get to heaven without the approval of the institutional church. And for 1,000 years, Europe's religious life was lived through church authority, with very minor exceptions. Unless a person took part in the church's sacraments with church approval, they were cut off from God, no matter how ethical they were in other ways. In its own way, the church did care about ethics and a whole lot about morals, but church authority decided which issues mattered and which ones didn't. Again, that difference between ethical relationship on the one hand and authority on the other, what you had to believe. And then came the Protestant Reformation, challenging the medieval church's authority. Martin Luther wrote that salvation was between each individual and God, the priesthood of all believers, as he called it. And John Calvin's writing was slightly different. He emphasized human depravity and worthlessness and predestination, But also he wrote about the bonds within the church as a community of God. So Calvinist churches, what we call Reformed or covenantal churches. This is interesting. There we go. Woe unto him who misstacks his papers. But that relationship within the church was kind of a fundamentalist tradition that had the seeds of liberal religion embedded inside it. And I'll say more about that in a couple of minutes. Today, we wouldn't think the differences between Christian theologies were a big deal, but at the time, they caused religious warfare between Roman Catholicism, Lutheranism, and Calvinism that killed millions. Millions. This was in the 1550s to about 1650 or so, give or take. Religious authority is a ruthless master. After all, if God is everything and human beings are worthless, then, which is what Calvin preached, then anything you do for God is justified up to and including killing people who disagree with you. And even in our own day, that's still the kind of thinking that gets Planned Parenthood's clinics bombed and motivates people to fly airplanes into buildings. Meanwhile, the minority churches of what we now call the Radical Reformation, including Polish and Transylvanian Unitarians, focused on a religion that served worthy humanity rather than the other way around, just as Christian progressives today have worked hard to try to reclaim the ethical faith that Jesus actually preached. Calvinist churches, including the Swedish Covenant Church, Scottish Covenanters, later known as Presbyterians, and English Puritans, some of whom settled in New England in the 1600s, also turned back to the Bible to find guidance on how faithful people ought to live together. And this was still mostly based on the ancient Near Eastern Vassal Treaty, but did begin to include the ethical component the ancient Hebrews had added. And that was one seed of liberal religion within Calvinism that I mentioned. In theory, a church's members manifested God's love and law by being in right relationship with one another. So, one of the first legal documents in America was an agreement called the Mayflower Compact in 1620, and a second that's important to us was the Cambridge Platform in 1637. Despite its religious language, the Mayflower Compact is a civil agreement. So you could say that the covenant was kind of turning full circle. It began with secular treaties that the ancient Hebrews adapted for religious use, and then Calvinist Puritans came to New England and readapted them and began to shape secular American democracy. The other covenant I mentioned, the Cambridge Platform, laid out what we now call congregational polity. Each congregation sets up its own policies, chooses its own minister, and so on. And without that independence between churches, which was one product of the Calvinist Puritans, American Unitarianism probably could not have developed in the first place, and definitely would not have developed the same way. Diverse freethinkers though we are, Unitarian Universalists are directly descended from that liberal seed within New England's conservative Puritans. Our covenants have evolved a long way since then, but as with any evolution, past vestiges still remain. We still operate using procedures similar to the Reformed Church, Presbyterians, and Congregationalists. But one important change, one really important change, was that we evolved from the vassal covenant model to the parody covenant. As diverse believers and non-believers, our covenants no longer have anything to do with God. As Theologian James Luther Adams put it, they are willing ethical agreements between free and equal partners. Or to say that a different way, right-wing fundamentalists still talk about covenants, but to them, a covenant is an obligation handed down from on high. For example, what they call covenant marriage, which I have a particular case on. That's all about obligations, mostly the wife's obligations to the husband. Using the Parody covenant model, we have a completely different definition. A covenant is a sincere, living promise voluntarily and entered into by equals. But as with any word that has multiple definitions, we need to pay attention to the definition we're using. It's not that one definition is right or wrong. That's a long conversation. But we need to understand the definition we're using. James Luther Adams was the most important Unitarian Universalist theologian of the 20th century and our leading authority on covenantal theology. There were others, but he was the leading one. Born in 1901 to a fundamentalist family, he eventually became non-theistic Christian, taught at my school, Meadville Lombard Theological School, and then went on to teach at Harvard Divinity School. In the decades after the Unitarian and Universalist merger, 1961, he wrote a lot about covenantal theology. He drew both from biblical history, but also from his ethical training. Faith must be the sister of justice, he wrote, and, quote, a purely spiritual faith is a purely spurious faith, close quote. And that's another topic that would fill a whole sermon. In a very short essay of 1974, From Cage to Covenant, he sums up his covenantal theology. He contrasts between what he called the cage, the authoritarian medieval church-state combine, which may be where we're headed if we're not careful, versus the covenant, a society of voluntary promises between equals. And this and other essays strongly influenced the Unitarian Universalist Association's rewrite of our principles in the 1980s. Adams emphasized 5 key points in covenants. First, human beings are at our best when we make serious promises to one another and try hard to keep them. We are, he says, the only animal that makes promises. We are, quote, promise-making, promise-keeping, promise-breaking, promise-renewing beings. Our very humanity lies in the way we carry out our promises to our families, our co-workers, our neighbors, and our fellow members of the human family. And to me, that's a profound statement. Second point is that to be genuine, a covenant must be a covenant of being. It's not just about good words. It's about ethical actions. Third, the covenant exists for the sake of each individual as well as for the whole group. It is both a gift and a responsibility. The individual is brought into just relationship with the rest of the group, but each individual is also, in their part, responsible for what the whole group does. If what my church or my nation does is wrong, I share in that responsibility. It's not just about blaming one person, one faction, or even one political party. It's not enough to say, I didn't know what was going on, or there's nothing I can do about it. We heard a lot of that following the Second World War. My covenantal duty is to be informed about what's happening and to act on that information. Fourth, Adams says the covenantal responsibility is especially directed toward the deprived. Covenantal living demands that we pay attention to those who suffer from society's neglect or injustice, and that we try to do something about it. And he also reminds us of the difference that can exist between our speech and our actions. One task of the covenantal church, he writes, is to call attention to the gap between people's noble-sounding words versus harmful or oppressive actions. And finally, he makes the point that, quote, the covenant is not fundamentally a legal covenant. It depends on faithfulness, and faithfulness is nerved by loyalty, by love, close quote. In other words, covenantal living is not a legal contract, nor is it about obeying the letter of the law while through greed or heedlessness we hurt people. Violation of a covenant is serious, not because it breaks a law, but because it's a violation of trust. It's a breach of faith. And that kind of living promise, I should say, calls forth the best that is in a person, but we're human. We make mistakes. Promises do get broken, so we try again. Our covenant does not ask us to be perfect. It does ask us to look at our own mistakes and try earnestly to correct them. So that's a quick primer, Covenantal Religion 101. But it really does embody a kind of simple and human faith. Just getting out of bed in the morning makes a statement about life and ultimate reality based solely on faith, namely that life is worth living. It's worth getting up in the morning. Your life matters, and my life matters as well. And the future can still be better than the past. Those are all faith statements. Fulfilling our covenantal promises, being true to one another, honest enough to admit our own human mistakes and cultural shortcomings and trying to correct them, those seem to be simple things, but that doesn't make them easy. We can only do our best. Let us do our best together. Amen. May it be so.